The rain had started 3 days before the wedding. Not mine, of course, but my sister's. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. I stood at the edge of the grand hall, my fingers tracing the worn stone of the archway, feeling the cold seep through the thin fabric of my dress, the scent of wet earth mixed with expensive perfumes, candle wax, and something sharper. Fear disguised as celebration. Wolves filled every corner of the estate, their laughter too loud, their movements too careful, as if they were all performing in a play where no one had bothered to give me a script. I was always the shadow in this family. The broken one. The Omega who couldn't shift properly, whose wolf was so weak that even the lowest-ranking pack members looked at me with pity, or worse, contempt. My hair, pale as winter wheat, marked me as different even among my own siblings. My mother used to say it was a gift from the moon, but after my first failed shift at 13, she stopped saying much to me at all. Celeste, my older sister, stood in the center of the room like a sun that demanded orbit. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in perfect waves, and her wolf radiated strength even in human form. She was laughing at something one of the visiting alphas had said, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She was supposed to marry the king. The disabled alpha king who ruled the northern territories with an iron fist despite his condition. A king no one had seen in public for nearly 2 years. The arrangement had been political, of course. Our father, desperate to secure our pack's position after a series of territorial disputes, had negotiated the match. Celeste would become queen, our family would rise, everything would be perfect, except Celeste had other plans. I watched her now, saw the way her eyes kept drifting to the young alpha from the eastern ridge. The one with golden eyes and a smile that promised trouble. I'd heard them last night, whispering in the garden when they thought everyone was asleep. Her voice had been urgent, pleading. His had been smooth, convincing. He's crippled, Celeste. He can't even walk. You'd be wasting yourself on a broken king. But father will never... Let your sister go. The pale one. She's Omega. She's useless here anyway. Send her in your place. By the time anyone realizes, it'll be too late. I'd backed away before hearing more, my heart hammering against my ribs. Surely they wouldn't. Surely even my father, with all his ambition and disappointment in me, wouldn't sacrifice me like that. But as I stood there in the hall, watching my sister's performance, watching my father's calculating eyes, I felt the truth settle over me like a burial shroud. Eliana. My father's voice cut through the noise, sharp as a blade. The room didn't quiet. They wouldn't. Not for me. But I felt the shift in attention, the way certain wolves turned their heads just slightly to watch. I moved toward him. Each step measured, practiced. I'd learned long ago how to be small, how to take up as little space as possible. My father stood near the fireplace, his broad frame blocking most of the warmth. Beside him, my mother stared into the flames, her expression unreadable. Yes, father? He didn't look at me. He never really looked at me, not since the incident when I was 15, when my incomplete shift had left me unconscious for 3 days, and the pack healers had whispered that perhaps it would be kinder to let me go. I'd heard them through the fevered haze. I'd heard everything. There's been a complication, he said, his voice low enough that only our family could hear. Celeste is unwell. A sudden fever. She cannot travel to the northern territories. I felt my mother tense beside me. My younger brother, Morgan, who'd been pretending not to listen, went very still. The king expects a bride in 3 days, father continued. The treaty depends on this union. If we fail to provide what was promised, the consequences will be severe. My mouth went dry. Father, surely if you explain, you will go in her place. He finally turned to look at me, and I saw nothing in his eyes. No warmth, no regret, no acknowledgement that he was sending his daughter to an uncertain fate. You're Omega. You were always meant for breeding and obedience. At least this way, you'll be useful. The words hit me like physical blows, but I'd learned not to flinch, not to cry, not to show how deeply the cuts went. The king doesn't know Celeste personally, my mother said softly, still staring at the flames. They've never met. The arrangement was made through intermediaries. You're both blonde. Celeste's hair is golden, I whispered. Mine is almost white. You'll wear a veil, Father said. The king is blind, Eliana. He lost his sight in the war. He won't know the difference. Blind. The word ricocheted through my mind. They'd said he was disabled, but no one had mentioned blindness. Suddenly, the rumors made more sense. The reason he'd disappeared from public life. The reason other packs spoke of him with a mixture of pity and fear. He's also said to be difficult, my mother added, and I heard the warning in her tone. Angry. Violent, some say. The injury that took his sight also damaged his wolf. He can barely shift. He's isolated himself in the northern palace with only a handful of guards. He won't hurt you, Father said, though his tone suggested he didn't actually care if that was true. You're not important enough to hurt. Just submit, be quiet, and produce heirs if the moon wills it. That's all anyone expects from you. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run into the rain and keep running until I found some corner of the world where broken omegas could exist without shame. But I'd been trained too well. When do I leave? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Hollow, distant, like it belonged to someone else. Tomorrow at dawn. The king's guards are already here. They're waiting. Father turned away, dismissing me with the gesture. Don't embarrass us, Eliana. For once in your life, be useful. I walked out of the hall in a daze, barely aware of the rain that had started again, heavier now, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. Celeste was already gone, spirited away to some private room where she could maintain her convenient illness. In my small chamber, barely more than a storage room really, I sat on the narrow bed and tried to understand what was happening. Tomorrow, I would be married to a king I'd never met, a disabled, blind, angry king who lived in isolation and, according to rumor, despised weakness above all things, and I was the weakest wolf in my pack. The rain continued its relentless percussion. I closed my eyes and tried to find my wolf, that distant presence that had always felt more like a ghost than a companion. She stirred slightly, a whisper of awareness, and I felt something I rarely felt from her. Resolve. Perhaps this was always meant to be. Perhaps broken things were meant to find each other. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn broke gray and cold, I dressed in the white gown they'd left for me, Celeste's wedding dress, taken in hastily to fit my smaller frame. The veil was thick, obscuring my face almost completely. I looked like a ghost. I felt like one. The king's guards were waiting in the courtyard. They were massive, silent men with eyes that revealed nothing. They didn't speak to me, didn't acknowledge me as anything more than cargo to be transported. The journey north would take 2 days by carriage. As we pulled away from the estate, I looked back once. I saw my father in the window, already turning away. I saw Morgan, my brother, lifting his hand in what might have been a wave or a farewell. I didn't see Celeste. The rain followed us north, and with each mile, I felt myself disappearing a little more. By the time we reached the northern palace, I wasn't sure there was anything left of me to break. The northern palace wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined something grand and imposing, all sharp towers and military precision. Instead, what rose from the mist as our carriage climbed the mountain road was something older, wilder, a fortress carved from dark stone that seemed to grow directly from the cliffs themselves. Moss clung to the walls, and ancient trees pressed close, their branches scraping against the upper windows like fingers seeking entry. It looked less like a palace and more like a prison. The rain had finally stopped, but the air hung heavy with moisture, and everything smelled of pine and stone and something underneath that I couldn't quite name. Decay, maybe, or just profound loneliness. The guards led me through a side entrance, not the grand front doors I noticed. We moved through corridors lit by torches that cast more shadows than light, our footsteps echoing off walls that had probably stood for centuries. I saw no servants, no courtiers, none of the bustling life that should fill a royal residence, just emptiness, and the occasional sound of wind howling through unseen passages. Wait here. One of the guards finally spoke, his voice rough with disuse. He gestured to a small antechamber and disappeared, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the wedding dress that suddenly felt like a costume I had no right to wear. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my heart beating so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Through a narrow window I could see mountains stretching endlessly, their peaks disappearing into low clouds. Beautiful and isolating in equal measure. "So you came," the voice came from behind me, and I spun around, my breath catching. He stood in the doorway, tall, broader than any man I'd ever seen, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders, and a face that would have been handsome if not for the terrible scar that ran from his left temple down across his eye and cheek, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were pale, almost colorless, and they stared past me, through me, focused on nothing. Blind. Truly blind. "Your Majesty." I managed a curtsy, though my legs shook. The veil still covered my face. I hadn't dared remove it. He moved into the room with surprising grace for someone who couldn't see, his hand trailing along the wall. He stopped a few feet away from me, his head tilted slightly as if listening. "They sent you alone? No family to witness the marriage?" His voice was cold, each word precisely cut. How very telling. They had matters to attend to. "The pack, don't lie to me." He moved closer, and I fought the instinct to step back. "I can hear your heartbeat. It's racing. You're terrified. And you're not her, are you?" My blood turned to ice. "I don't—" "Celeste Ashworth. Golden hair, strong wolf, promised to me as part of a treaty I didn't want." He reached out suddenly, and his hand found the edge of my veil. I froze as he carefully lifted it, his fingers gentle despite the hardness in his voice. "You're not her." The veil fell away, and I stood exposed before him, though his blind eyes couldn't actually see me. But somehow, I felt more naked under that sightless gaze than I ever had before. "No," I whispered, "I'm not." "Who are you?" "Eliana, her sister." The truth came out in a rush. "Celeste couldn't. She didn't want. They sent me instead." "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I waited for rage, for violence, for him to call the guards and have me thrown out, or worse. Instead, he laughed. A sound so bitter and empty it made my chest ache. Of course they did. Send the broken Omega to the broken king. He turned away, moving to the window with that uncanny grace. "Did they tell you about me, Eliana? Did they warn you what kind of monster you were being sacrificed to? They said you were injured in the war, that you'd lost your sight. And my wolf." His hand clenched against the window frame. "The injury severed something inside me. I can barely feel him anymore, can't shift, can't lead hunts or run with my pack. I'm an alpha in name only, a cripple playing at being king." The pain in his voice was so raw, it made me forget my own fear for a moment. I'd spent my whole life being called broken, being treated as less than, but I'd never heard someone speak about it with such savage honesty. "You're not a cripple," I said quietly. "You're still here, still ruling." He turned back toward me, and even though he couldn't see, I felt the weight of his attention. Pretty words from a girl who was discarded by her own family. "Tell me, Eliana, what's wrong with you that they'd send you to this fate instead of the sister they actually promised?" I could have lied, should have lied, but something about the darkness of this place, the honesty of his pain, made me tell the truth. My wolf is weak. I can barely shift, and when I do, it's incomplete. Painful. I'm Omega, but even by Omega standards, I'm defective. I wrapped my arms around myself. My father said I was useless. He said at least this way, I could serve some purpose. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of wind against stone. "What's your name?" I asked. "Your real name, not your title." "Casimir." He said it slowly, as if he'd forgotten how it sounded. Though no one's called me that in years. It's always Your Majesty, or My Lord, or when they think I can't hear, the Broken King. "Casimir," I repeated, testing the name. It felt old, powerful, like the stones of this palace. "I'm supposed to marry you. Today, I think. They had a priest waiting." "No." He cut me off. "Not today. Not like this, with you dressed in your sister's gown, and both of us pretending this is anything other than what it is, a political transaction built on rejection and desperation." But the treaty can wait one more day. He moved toward the door, then paused. There are rooms prepared for you in the east wing. My chambers are in the west. You won't be disturbed. Tomorrow we'll formalize this farce. Tonight, at least, you can rest without the weight of obligation. Casimir, I started, but he was already gone, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor with that same fluid grace. I was shown to my rooms by a silent servant, an older woman with kind eyes who didn't speak, but made sure I had water and food and a fire burning in the hearth. The chambers were beautiful in a cold, unused way. Like everything in this palace, large windows looked out over the mountains, and the bed was enormous, piled with furs that smelled faintly of cedar. I should have felt relieved. I should have been grateful for the reprieve. Instead, I felt hollowed out, uncertain. Casimir wasn't what I'd expected. He was angry, yes, and wounded in ways that went far beyond physical scars, but he'd shown me more honest emotion in 10 minutes than my family had in years. That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the palace, the creaking of old wood, the whisper of wind, and somewhere distant, the howl of a wolf. Just one, solitary and mournful, echoing off the mountains. I wondered if it was him, if his wolf was truly as lost as he claimed, or if it was just crying out from somewhere deep inside, unable to find its way back. The next day arrived gray and somber. The wedding ceremony was brief, conducted by a priest who looked uncomfortable, and 2 guards who served as witnesses. Casimir stood rigid throughout, his hand cold when it took mine for the binding ritual. I spoke my vows to a man who couldn't see me, who didn't want me, who was just as trapped as I was. When it was done, I was a queen, and I'd never felt more invisible. The days that followed developed a strange rhythm. I barely saw Casimir. He kept to his wing of the palace, conducting his duties through intermediaries. I was given freedom to explore, to walk the grounds, to exist in this vast empty space however I wished. The servants were few and quiet, but not unkind. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, and I was utterly, completely alone. A week passed, then 2. I began to understand why Casimir had isolated himself. The palace was so remote that visitors were rare, and the pack that lived in the surrounding territory seemed to regard their king with a mixture of reverence and unease. They never came close. I spent my days in the library, a massive room filled with books that smelled of age and forgotten wisdom. I read about the history of the northern territories, about the wars that had shaped this land, about the old magic that people said still lingered in the mountains. And I thought about Casimir, alone in his wing, trapped in darkness and pain. It was on the 16th night that everything changed. I woke to the sound of screaming. The screaming tore through the silence of the palace like claws through fabric, raw, agonized, barely human. My heart lurched as I threw off the furs and ran barefoot into the corridor, my thin nightgown offering no protection against the cold stone beneath my feet. The sound came from the west wing, from Casimir's chambers. Guards rushed past me, their faces tight with something that looked like fear. I followed them, ignoring the voice in my head that said I had no place there, that I was just the unwanted bride, the replacement, the ghost haunting these halls. The doors to his chambers stood open, and the scene inside made me freeze. Casimir was on the floor, his body contorted in a position that should have been impossible. His shirt was torn, revealing skin that seemed to ripple and shift, as if something beneath was trying to break free. The guards kept their distance, their hands on their weapons, uncertain. The older one, I'd learned his name was Gregor, looked stricken. "It's the wolf," he said when he saw me. "It happens sometimes. The injury. Something gets triggered, and his wolf tries to emerge, but it can't complete the shift. It's been worse since..." Another scream cut him off. Casimir's back arched, and I saw the agony written in every line of his body. His blind eyes were open, but seeing nothing. Lost in some internal hell. "What do you do?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "When this happens, what helps?" "Nothing helps." Gregor's voice was heavy with resignation. "We wait. Eventually it passes, Sometimes it takes hours. We keep him from hurting himself or others. That's all we can do. I watched Casimir writhe on the floor, watched the guards standing helpless around him like mourners at a funeral, and something inside me cracked open. I knew that pain, not the physical agony of a broken shift. Mine had never been violent like this. But the deeper wound of having your wolf betray you, of being trapped between two forms and belonging fully to neither. Leave us, I said quietly. Gregor turned to me, his expression uncertain. My lady, it's not safe. I said leave. I met his eyes, and maybe he saw something there that surprised him, because after a moment, he nodded and gestured for the other guards to follow. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, and suddenly it was just me and Casimir, and the sound of his labored breathing. I approached slowly, carefully, the way I'd learned to approach frightened animals. Casimir, can you hear me? A growl was my only answer. Low, threatening, more wolf than man. I knelt beside him, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. His muscles were locked, trembling with the effort of a transformation that wouldn't come. I'd read about this in one of the library books, a rare condition where the neural pathways between human and wolf were damaged, leaving the victim trapped in an endless, agonizing limbo. I know you're in pain, I said softly. I know your wolf is trying to break free and can't find the way. I understand that more than you think. His breathing hitched slightly, and I took it as a sign he could hear me beneath the chaos. I did something then that I'd never done willingly before. I reached for my own wolf, that weak, fractured presence I'd spent years trying to ignore. She stirred reluctantly, fragile as glass, but she came, and I let her rise to the surface just enough that my eyes shifted. Not a full transformation, just enough that Casimir might sense what I was doing. My wolf is broken too, I whispered. She's always been incomplete. When I try to shift, it feels like being torn apart from the inside, like my body and my wolf are speaking different languages, and neither can understand the other. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the tremors running through him. But she's still there. She's still mine, and your wolf is still yours, Casimir. He's just lost. I began to hum, a melody I didn't consciously remember learning, something that felt ancient and instinctive. My mother had hummed it once, long ago, before I became a disappointment. It was a song for calming restless wolves, for soothing the beast when it became too wild. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Casimir's breathing began to even out. The violent tremors became shudders, then shivers. His body gradually relaxed, the terrible tension draining away like water. I kept humming, kept my hand on his shoulder, and reached deeper for my own wolf. She was so weak, so tentative, but she responded to my call. And then I felt something extraordinary. Casimir's wolf, that wounded, raging presence I could sense beneath his skin, turned toward mine like a drowning man reaching for a rope. Our wolves touched. Not physically, but in that space where spirit and instinct lived. His was massive, powerful, but fractured and in such pain. Mine was small, incomplete, barely there. But she wasn't afraid. She reached toward his wolf with something like recognition, like greeting an old friend who'd been gone too long. And in that moment of connection, something shifted. Casimir gasped, and his body finally went still. His breathing slowed to normal. The rippling beneath his skin ceased. He lay there on the cold floor, exhausted but calm, and I felt his wolf retreat, not back into the chaos, but into something closer to rest. I kept my hand on his shoulder, kept humming quietly, until I was sure the crisis had passed. Eliana? His voice was hoarse, broken. What did you do? I don't know, I admitted. I couldn't watch you suffer alone. He pushed himself into a sitting position slowly, every movement careful. His blind eyes turned toward me, and even without sight, I felt the intensity of his focus. You called your wolf. I felt her. Yes. They told me you couldn't shift properly, that you were defective. I am. I pulled my hand back, suddenly self-conscious. My wolf is weak. She's barely there most of the time, but she's still mine, and tonight she wanted to help. Casimir was quiet for a long moment, his chest still rising and falling with deep breaths. No one's been able to calm an episode before. No one's even tried. They just wait for it to end. That must be lonely, I said softly. He laughed, but it wasn't bitter this time, just tired. You understand loneliness, don't you? That's why they sent you, because you know what it's like to be set aside, to be the one no one wants to deal with. Yes. There was no point in denying it. Your wolf spoke to mine. He reached out, his hand searching until it found my arm. His touch was gentle, questioning. How? She's Omega. Weak, you said. My wolf is Alpha, or was, before the injury. He shouldn't have responded to her. Maybe he did because she understands him. I covered his hand with mine without thinking. Maybe strength isn't what he needs right now. We sat there on the floor together, two broken people with fractured wolves, and for the first time since arriving at this cold palace, I didn't feel invisible. Stay, Casimir said suddenly. Just for tonight. Not... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Not as a wife, just as... I don't want to be alone if it happens again. I'll stay, I promised. I helped him to his bed, massive and piled with furs like mine, and sat in the chair beside it, but he reached out, his hand finding mine in the darkness. Tell me about your wolf, he said. Tell me when you first knew she was different. And so I did. I told him about my first shift at 13, how it had only been partial, how my bones had cracked and reformed wrong, and I'd screamed until I passed out. I told him about the healers who'd said I might not survive, about waking up to my mother's tears and my father's disappointment. I told him about years of trying and failing, of being Omega in a world that already saw Omegas as lesser, and being defective even by those standards. He listened without interrupting, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then, I was in the southern campaigns when it happened. We were ambushed by rogues, exiled wolves with nothing to lose. One of them had a cursed blade, something forged with dark magic. It caught me across the face and down through my shoulder. His hand moved to the scar unconsciously. I felt my wolf scream and then... silence. Not death, but something worse. Like he was still there, but trapped behind a wall I couldn't break through. The healers saved my life but couldn't restore my sight or my connection to my wolf. I'm sorry, I whispered. I became something I swore I'd never be. A burden. An alpha who couldn't lead. A king who couldn't protect his people. So I hid here, in this fortress, and let the world forget about me. He turned his head toward me, until tonight, when a broken Omega reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. Something warm bloomed in my chest. Not love, not yet, but the seed of understanding that could grow into something more. We're quite a pair, aren't we? I said, with a small smile he couldn't see. A crippled king and a defective queen. He squeezed my hand. They must be laughing about us back in your father's pack. Probably, I admitted. But they're not here. We are. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside his windows, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Casimir finally fell into a peaceful sleep, his hand still holding mine, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Even if that somewhere was a cold palace with a broken king and a future as uncertain as morning mist. Bloco 4. The weeks that followed that night changed everything in ways I hadn't anticipated. Casimir and I developed a routine that felt less like a political arrangement and more like two people learning to exist in the same space without pretense. He no longer retreated to his wing of the palace as if I were a ghost to be avoided. Instead, we found ourselves sharing meals, walking the grounds together, talking about everything and nothing. I learned that he had a sharp wit buried beneath the layers of pain and isolation. He learned that I had opinions about politics, about pack dynamics, about the books I devoured in his library. He'd never expected intelligence from an Omega, he admitted one afternoon, and certainly not from one his pack would have dismissed as worthless. That says more about their limitations than yours, he'd said, his fingers tracing the spines of books on a shelf while I read aloud to him. He'd asked me to do that, read to him. His world had become so narrow after losing his sight, and my voice, he said, brought color back to the darkness. But it wasn't easy. The episodes continued, though less frequently. I'd wake to the sound of his struggle and rush to his chambers, using that strange connection between our wolves to calm the storm inside him. Each time, it seemed to work a little better, as if our wolves were learning to communicate in a language neither of us fully understood. The palace staff began to notice. Gregor, who'd been Casimir's guard for over a decade, stopped looking at me with suspicion and started offering something that might have been respect. The servants whispered less and smiled more. Even the distant pack members who occasionally came to the palace with reports or requests seemed to sense the shift in their king's demeanor. But peace, I was learning, was a fragile thing in a world built on power and territory. It was 6 weeks after our wedding when the letter arrived. I was in the library, surrounded by texts about ancient healing practices, when Gregor found me. His expression was grim. "My lady, there's a delegation from the Southern Council. They're demanding an audience with the king." My stomach dropped. The Southern Council represented the largest coalition of packs in the territories, powerful, traditional, and deeply invested in maintaining the old hierarchies. They'd supported Casimir before his injury, but rumors had reached even our isolated palace that they were growing restless with an alpha king who never showed his face, who couldn't hunt or fight or lead in the ways they deemed essential. "Does Casimir know? He's meeting with them now. He asked that you join him." That surprised me. In public matters, I'd remained firmly in the background. The quiet wife, the political necessity. Casimir had never requested my presence at official meetings before. I found them in the Great Hall, a room I'd rarely entered because it felt too vast, too empty. But today it was filled with tension thick enough to choke on. 5 alphas stood in a semicircle before the throne where Casimir sat, his posture regal despite the darkness that surrounded him. They radiated power and barely concealed contempt. I recognized one of them, Roman, a massive alpha with silver streaking his dark hair, known for his traditional views and his influence over the smaller packs. His eyes found me as I entered, and I saw the dismissal in them before he even spoke. "Ah, the Queen." His voice dripped with false courtesy. "How unexpected to see you here." I moved to stand beside Casimir's throne, my heart hammering but my expression calm. His hand reached out slightly, and I placed mine in it, a gesture of unity that wasn't lost on our audience. "Eliana is my wife and queen," Casimir said, his voice carrying the weight of authority I'd rarely heard from him. "She belongs at my side." Roman's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Your Majesty, though we'd expected Celeste Ashworth, if memory serves. Your queen seems different than the one promised. Circumstances changed," Casimir replied smoothly. "But that's not why you're here, is it, Roman? You didn't travel 3 days in winter weather to question my choice of bride." The alpha's expression hardened. "No. We came because the council has concerns. You've been isolated for 2 years, Your Majesty. You don't attend gatherings. You don't lead hunts. You don't show yourself to your people. There are rumors that your injury has left you unable to fulfill your duties as Alpha King." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. "I rule the Northern Territories as I always have," Casimir said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The fact that I do so from my palace rather than a hunting ground doesn't diminish my authority." "Authority comes from strength," another alpha spoke up, younger, with ambitious eyes. "An alpha who can't shift, who can't see, who hides behind stone walls, that's not strength, that's weakness. And weakness invites challenge." I felt Casimir's hand tighten around mine, felt the tension radiating through him. This was what he'd feared, what he'd isolated himself to avoid. They were questioning his right to rule, circling like predators around wounded prey. "You think I'm weak?" Casimir's voice was ice. "You're welcome to challenge me, Garrett. Though I wonder if you have the spine to face a king in his own hall." Garrett paled slightly, but held his ground. "I'm not here to challenge, Your Majesty. I'm here as part of a delegation expressing the council's concerns. We want what's best for all packs, and a king who can't lead." "Can't lead?" The words burst from me before I could stop them. Every eye in the room turned to me. and I felt Casimir's surprise. But I'd spent 6 weeks watching this man struggle against pain and isolation, watching him rule with intelligence and fairness despite his limitations. And I couldn't stay silent. My husband rules the most stable territories in the region. While you've had border disputes and internal conflicts, the northern territories have maintained peace. He's negotiated treaties, managed resources, and protected his people, all without needing to prove himself through displays of dominance. "You're Omega," Roman said, his voice laced with condescension. "You don't understand the nature of alpha leadership." "I understand that true leadership isn't about physical prowess alone," I shot back, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "If it were, then every strong alpha would make a good king. But they don't. Some of the most powerful wolves I've known were the worst leaders, all dominance and no wisdom." "Careful, little Omega." Roman's eyes narrowed. "You speak boldly for someone who was sent here as a replacement, a second choice deemed too defective for her own pack." The words struck like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. "Yes, I was rejected by my pack. Yes, I'm defective by traditional standards. But I've learned something in my time here that perhaps the Council hasn't. Weakness and strength aren't always what they appear to be. The king's injury hasn't diminished his ability to rule. If anything, it's given him perspective that other alphas lack." "Perspective doesn't hold territory," Garrett sneered. "Perspective doesn't defend against enemies." "What happens when the rogues attack? When rivals see an opening? A blind king with a broken wolf isn't going to inspire fear or loyalty. Then they're fools." I felt my wolf stir, that weak, fractured presence responding to my emotion. Fear and loyalty aren't the same thing. You can rule through fear, but it won't last. My husband rules through intelligence and fairness, and that's worth more than any show of force. "Pretty words," Roman said, "but the Council requires proof. We need to see that our king is still capable. You need to leave." Casimir stood, and even blind, even without being able to shift, he radiated such authority that the alphas actually took a step back. "You've delivered your message. You've expressed your concerns. Now I'll give you my response. I am king. I will continue to be king, and if the Council has a problem with that, they're welcome to bring a formal challenge, but they should know that I won't face them alone." His hand squeezed mine, and I understood what he meant. Whatever came, we'd face it together. Roman's expression was unreadable as he inclined his head. "Very well, Your Majesty. We'll relay your message to the Council. But know this. The old ways still matter. Strength still matters. And if you can't prove you're still worthy of the crown, there are others who will gladly take it." They left in a rustle of expensive clothes and barely contained aggression. When the doors closed behind them, Casimir sank back onto the throne, his face drawn. "That was dangerous," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have spoken. They could use your words against us." "They were going to challenge you anyway," I replied. "At least now they know you don't stand alone." He was quiet for a long moment, his blind eyes directed toward where I stood. "Why did you defend me? You don't owe me anything. This marriage was forced on both of us." "Because they were wrong," I said simply. "And because in the past 6 weeks, I've seen who you really are. You're not weak, Casimir. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. You just carry your strength differently now." He reached for me, and I went to him, letting him pull me close. His arms wrapped around me, and I felt him shaking, not from pain or anger, but from something deeper. "I don't know how to be what they want," he whispered against my hair. "I don't know how to prove I'm still worthy when I can't do the things that made me king in the first place." "Then maybe you don't prove it their way," I said. "Maybe you prove it yours." That night, lying in my chambers, I couldn't sleep. The confrontation with the Council had shaken something loose inside me. I'd spoken up, defended Casimir, claimed my place beside him in a way I'd never dared before, and instead of feeling exposed or vulnerable, I felt alive. My wolf stirred restlessly, and I reached for her, that fragile connection we'd been building. She was still weak, still incomplete, but she was more present than she'd been in years. As if being here, being needed, had awakened something in both of us. I heard it then. the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside my room. Heavy, uncertain. A knock at my door, soft and hesitant. "Eliana?" Casimir's voice. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't disturb you, but..." I opened the door before he could finish. He stood there in loose sleeping clothes, his hair disheveled, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. "Another episode?" I asked gently. "No, I just..." He ran a hand through his hair. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said today. About strength. About proving myself. And I realized something." "What?" "That for 2 years I've been hiding. Not just from the council or from my responsibilities, but from myself. From the fear that without my sight and without my wolf, I'm nothing. That I have no value." He reached out, and I took his hand, drawing him into my room. "But you don't look at me that way. You never have. Even when I'm at my worst, even when I'm screaming on the floor, unable to control my own body. You see something in me worth saving, because there is," I said softly. "You're brilliant, Casimir. You're kind underneath all the anger and pain. You're fair and thoughtful, and you care about your people even when you're terrified they'll reject you." "They will reject me," he said. "The council won't give up. They'll find a way to force a challenge, and when they do, I'll fail. I can't fight like this. I can't shift. I'll lose everything. Not everything." I stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. "You'll still have me, for whatever that's worth." His hand came up to cup my face, his thumb tracing my cheek with careful gentleness. "It's worth more than you know," he whispered. "You're the first person in years who's made me feel like I might be more than my injuries, like I might still have something to offer." "You have everything to offer," I said. "You just need to remember that you're not alone anymore." He kissed me then, soft and tentative, a question more than a claim, and I kissed him back, feeling something shift between us. Something that went beyond political arrangement or shared trauma. This was choice. This was connection. This was 2 broken people deciding that maybe, together, they could be whole. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, and I felt his breath steady and calm. "Stay with me tonight?" he asked. "Not in my rooms, but here. Let me just be close to someone who doesn't fear me or pity me." "I'm not going anywhere," I promised. We lay together in my bed, his arms around me, and I felt safer than I had in years. Outside, winter wind howled against the palace walls, but inside, we'd found warmth. The council's threat still loomed. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, I believed we might face it and survive. Together. The challenge came 3 weeks later, delivered on parchment sealed with the council's mark. Roman himself would face Casimir in formal combat, a fight to establish dominance and the right to rule the northern territories. It was exactly what we'd feared, dressed up in the language of tradition and honor. "They've set the date for the next full moon," Casimir said, his voice carefully neutral as Gregor read the letter aloud. We were in his study, the fire crackling in the hearth doing nothing to warm the cold dread settling in my bones. 2 weeks. They want it public, witnessed by representatives from every major pack. "It's a trap," Gregor said bluntly. "Roman knows you can't shift. He's choosing combat because it's the one challenge you can't meet on equal terms. Then I'll meet it on unequal terms." Casimir's jaw was set, his blind eyes staring toward the fire as if he could feel its light. "I won't surrender my crown without a fight, even if it's one I can't win." "There has to be another way," I said, my mind racing through everything I'd read in the library, every scrap of pack law and ancient tradition. Some precedent, some alternative. "There isn't." Casimir's voice was final. "The challenge has been issued. If I refuse, I forfeit. If I fight and lose, the result is the same. Either way, Roman becomes king." The injustice of it burned through me. Casimir had ruled well, had maintained peace and prosperity despite his limitations. But in the eyes of the traditional packs, none of that mattered. Only strength mattered. Only the ability to dominate mattered. What if you didn't fight alone? The words were out before I'd fully formed the thought. Both men turned to look at me. Pack law allows for a champion in certain circumstances, I continued, the pieces clicking together as I spoke. If the alpha is injured or incapacitated, a trusted member of the pack can stand in their place. It's old law, rarely invoked, but it exists. A champion must be alpha, Gregor said slowly, and they must be bonded to the king, family, or mate. You're his mate, but you're Omega. It wouldn't be allowed. Why not? I challenged. The law doesn't specify the champion's designation, only that they be bonded and trusted. I'm his wife, his queen. If anyone has the right to stand for him, it's me. Casimir shook his head immediately. No, absolutely not. Eliana, Roman would destroy you. He's one of the most powerful alphas in the territories. You can barely shift. It would be a massacre, I finished quietly. I know, but it would also buy us time. Time to find another solution, time to rally support, time to watch you suffer for my failures. His voice cracked. I won't do that. I won't sacrifice you to prolong the inevitable. I moved to kneel before him, taking his hands in mine. Listen to me. These past weeks with you have been the first time in my life I've felt like I mattered. Like I had purpose beyond being someone's disappointment. You gave me that, Casimir. You saw value in me when no one else did. Let me return the favor. By getting yourself hurt? By letting Roman humiliate you in front of every pack in the region? By showing them that strength comes in forms they don't recognize, I said. By proving that an Omega can stand before an Alpha and not break. Maybe I'll lose. Probably I'll lose. But at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have fought for something that matters. The silence stretched between us, heavy with impossible choices. Finally, Gregor spoke. There might be a way. A slim chance, but he hesitated, looking between us. The library has texts on ancient bonding rituals, true mate bonds, not just political marriages. If you and the king were to complete a full bond, wolf to wolf, soul to soul, it might strengthen you both. I've heard stories of mates sharing power, of weaker wolves drawing on their bonded partner's strength. Those are legends, Casimir said. But I heard the hope threading through his skepticism. Maybe, Gregor acknowledged, but we're already dealing with the impossible. What's one more legend? The next 2 weeks became a desperate race against time. I buried myself in the library's oldest texts, searching for anything about true mate bonds and how they were formed. What I found was both beautiful and terrifying. Accounts of wolves who'd bonded so completely that they could feel each other's emotions, share strength, even communicate without words. But the ritual required something I wasn't sure we had: absolute trust and vulnerability from both partners. Casimir was willing to try, more than willing. Desperate, actually, though he tried to hide it. Not because he believed it would work, but because if these were to be our last days together, he wanted them to mean something. We performed the ritual 5 nights before the challenge, under a waxing moon that painted the palace grounds in silver light. Gregor and 2 trusted servants bore witness as Casimir and I stood in the ancient stone circle behind the palace, a place so old that moss covered the carved symbols, but the power remained, thrumming beneath our feet like a heartbeat. The ritual required blood, just a drop from each of us, mixed and offered to the earth. It required words spoken in the old language, vows that went deeper than any wedding ceremony. And it required us to call our wolves fully, to let them emerge and recognize each other without fear or restraint. This was the part I dreaded. My wolf was so weak, so fractured. What if she couldn't emerge at all? What if the ritual failed because I was too broken to complete it? But when Casimir shifted, or tried to, I understood that we were both bringing our brokenness to this moment. His transformation was agonizing to watch, incomplete and wrong in ways that made my chest ache. He couldn't fully become wolf, stuck in that terrible in-between state that had tortured him for 2 years. And yet, he held the form. Trembling, in pain, but present. I reached for my wolf, expecting the usual resistance, the feeling of trying to grasp smoke, but she came to me differently this time. Not with the violent force of a full shift, but with a gentle unfurling, like wings stretching after a long sleep. My bones didn't break and reform. Instead, I felt myself blur, change, become something between human and wolf that shouldn't have been possible but somehow was. When I looked at Casimir through wolf-touched eyes, I saw him clearly for the first time. Not his physical form, but the blazing spirit underneath. His wolf was there, massive and powerful, and yes, wounded, but not destroyed. Never destroyed. Our wolves touched, and the world exploded into sensation. I felt his pain as if it were my own, the constant ache from his injury, the frustration of blindness, the fear of inadequacy that had eaten at him for years. But I also felt his strength, the sheer force of will that had kept him ruling despite everything, the intelligence that burned bright in the darkness, the fierce protectiveness he felt for his people, and I realized with shock, for me. And he felt me. My fear, my years of rejection, the bone-deep loneliness of being unwanted. But also my resilience, the quiet strength that had survived when others would have broken, the compassion that had reached out to him when anyone else would have stayed away, and the love that had grown between us, roots pushing deep into stony soil. The bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock, and suddenly I wasn't alone in my own mind. Casimir was there, a presence as real as my own thoughts, and I was in his, and our wolves were no longer separate entities, but two parts of a greater whole. When we returned to human form, we collapsed together on the cold ground, gasping and crying, and laughing all at once. "I can feel you," Casimir whispered, his hands framing my face. "I can feel you inside my mind, your emotions, your thoughts. It's like having sight again, but better. You're like light in the darkness, and you're like strength in my weakness," I said, because I could feel it. His alpha power flowing through the bond, not overwhelming me but supporting me, a foundation I could draw on. We're not broken anymore. We're just different. The night of the challenge arrived with cruel swiftness. The ancient fighting grounds had been prepared, a circular arena surrounded by hundreds of witnesses from packs across the territories. I could feel their skepticism, their anticipation of violence, their certainty that this would end with Roman's victory and a new king. Roman stood in the center of the arena, already shifted to his wolf form, a massive silver beast that radiated dominance and power. When I entered as Casimir's champion, still in human form, the crowd actually laughed. "This is your answer?" Roman's voice carried even in wolf form, the alpha dominance making the words clear. "A defective Omega? You insult us, Casimir. I stand for my king and my mate," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "If you want his crown, you'll have to go through me first." Roman laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "Gladly." He charged, and I had perhaps a second to react. Instead of trying to shift, which would leave me vulnerable during the transformation, I drew on the bond, pulling strength from Casimir who stood at the arena's edge. I felt his power flood through me, felt our wolves intertwine, and something remarkable happened. I shifted, but not into my usual incomplete form. The transformation was smooth, painless, natural, and when I emerged, I was wolf, fully wolf, for the first time in my life. Small compared to Roman, yes, but whole, complete, real. The crowd went silent. Roman recovered quickly, charging again with teeth bared. But I was faster, smaller, able to dodge where he expected easy victory. And every time he tried to pin me, I felt Casimir guiding me through the bond, his experience in combat flowing into my instincts. I couldn't win through strength. Roman was simply too powerful. But I didn't need to win. I just needed to survive, to prove that I wouldn't break, that an Omega bonded to her Alpha was stronger than they believed possible. The fight lasted longer than anyone expected. I was bleeding from a dozen wounds, exhausted beyond measure, but I stayed on my feet. And slowly, gradually, the crowd's mood changed. The laughter died. They watched with something closer to awe as the small blonde wolf refused to submit, refused to quit, drawing on reserves of strength that shouldn't have existed. Finally, Roman made a mistake. Overextended, left his throat exposed for just a moment. I couldn't take him down, but I could mark him, could draw blood that proved I was capable of landing a strike even on one of the most powerful alphas in the territories. When I did, the crowd erupted. Roman pulled back, panting, his eyes showing something that might have been respect. "Enough," he said. "You've proven your point, little Omega. You've got more spine than most alphas I've fought." I shifted back to human form, hardly caring that I was naked and bleeding before the assembled packs. Casimir was there immediately, wrapping me in a cloak, his hands checking my injuries with frantic care, even though I could feel through the bond that none of them were serious. "You're insane," he whispered. "Brave and brilliant, and completely insane." "I learned from the best," I said, swaying against him. Roman shifted back to human form as well, his expression unreadable. "The challenge stands," he said. "I still question whether a blind king can rule effectively, but your queen has proven something today. That loyalty and bond can create strength where none existed before. That's worthy of respect." He turned to address the crowd. "I withdraw my challenge, not because I couldn't win, but because I've seen something here that matters more than brute strength. This king has a mate who would face impossible odds for him. That says more about his worthiness to rule than any hunt or battle could." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, but Roman's word was law. The challenge was over. As we left the arena, I felt the eyes of every wolf there following us, not with contempt or pity, but with something closer to wonder. The defective Omega and the broken king, standing together against impossible odds and somehow surviving. The months that followed brought changes we never anticipated. Word spread about what had happened in the arena, about the Omega who'd fought an alpha and lived, about the bond that had made it possible. Casimir began receiving visitors again, not challenges, but requests for counsel, for wisdom, for the kind of leadership that came from understanding rather than domination. Our bond deepened with each passing day. Through it, Casimir could sense the world around him in ways that went beyond sight, and I found strength I'd never known I possessed, rooted in the certainty that I was no longer alone. We never did have a traditional royal life. No grand ceremonies, no elaborate court. But we had something better, a partnership built on understanding, on shared wounds that had become sources of strength rather than shame. 1 year after the challenge, as winter gave way to spring and the mountains bloomed with unexpected color, Casimir and I stood on the palace balcony watching the sunset I could see, and he could feel through our bond. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his arm around my waist. "Being forced to come here, to marry someone you'd never met." I thought about my answer carefully, because the truth was complicated. "I regret the circumstances," I said finally. "I regret the pain we both carried to get here. But regret this?" I turned to face him, letting him feel through our bond exactly what I meant. "Never. You showed me that being broken isn't the same as being worthless. You taught me that strength comes in forms the world doesn't always recognize. And you loved me when I didn't even love myself." He kissed me then, soft and deep, and I felt his love echo through the bond, steady, certain, unshakable. "My queen," he murmured against my lips. "My mate, my equal, my king," I replied. "My partner, my home." Below us, the palace grounds were filled with activity, pack members going about their lives, children playing, the rhythm of a community that had learned to accept their unusual rulers. We'd never be what the traditional packs expected. We'd never fit the mold of alpha dominance and omega submission. But we'd found something better: balance, harmony. Two broken pieces that fit together to create something stronger than either could have been alone. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, I felt my wolf stir contentedly, no longer fractured or incomplete, but whole in ways that had nothing to do with the perfection of her form, and everything to do with the bond that connected her to her mate. We were the rejected Omega and the disabled King, the ones who shouldn't have survived, let alone thrived. But we'd proven that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from being unbroken, but from choosing to heal together. And in that choice, in that bond, in that fierce, impossible love, we'd found everything we'd ever been searching for. We'd found home.